Iron-Scourge Chapter 1. The Breath of the Rust. The rain in the Crimson Delta wasn't rain. It was a weeping, a slow, agonizing bleed of iron-tinged water that stained the marshland in shades of rust and bruise. The air hung thick and heavy, choked with the metallic tang of decay, a scent that clung to your skin, your clothes, and burrowed into your lungs. Visibility rarely exceeded 20 feet. The perpetual mist swirling around the skeletal remains of trees, choked with clinging, rust-colored vines. It was a landscape sculpted by sorrow, a testament to a hunger that had devoured not just flesh and bone, but the very life force of the land. I moved through it like a ghost, a ripple in the stagnant air. My boots, reinforced with salvaged metal plating and worn leather, sank slightly into the slick earth, each step a quiet protest against the pervasive presence of the metal that held dominion here. I was known as Kaito, though the name felt as hollow as the echoing chambers of the abandoned fortress ID once called home. Ronin Tool, a blade without a lord, a vessel for a consuming purpose. My skin was a roadmap of scars, a brutal tapestry woven from the aftermath of a battle I barely remembered. The memory was fragmented, a kaleidoscope of shattered metal, incandescent pain, and a monstrous form of shifting iron, the metal demon. I'd been a warrior then, a samurai bound by a rigid code, utterly unprepared for a reality that defied understanding. My survival had demanded a grotesque adaptation, a parasitic embrace of rust itself. Now my flesh was layered with fused metal, shimmering plates of tarnished steel, and blackened iron interwoven with the remnants of my original form. It wasn't beauty, not by any conventional measure. It was the visceral consequence of a desperate bargain with entropy. My breath held the metallic tang of old coins, a constant reminder of the process I consumed rusted iron, absorbing its magnetic energy, transforming it into a fuel for my existence. I was tracking the source of the blight, a creeping paralysis that had gripped the village of Viridia. Viridia, clinging to the edge of the delta like a stubborn barnacle, was a collection of mud brick houses built around a crumbling shrine dedicated to the sky god. Once, it had been a place of quiet industry, famed for its skilled artisans who crafted intricate tools and weapons from the abundant iron ore. Now, it was a husk, its people gaunt, their movements sluggish, their eyes reflecting a dull, gray emptiness. The villagers spoke of the Shogun, Rust-Warden Shogun, who ruled from a fortress erected within the heart of the marsh. A twisted monument to conquest. It was constructed entirely from salvaged weaponry, rusted swords, shattered shields, broken cannons held together by an elaborate network of electromagnets. Had arrived a decade ago, a figure shrouded in rumor, said to have been a disgraced imperial officer, driven mad by the endless wars. He claimed to be restoring order, but his methods were brutal, ruthless. He used the magnets, colossal and humming with dark energy, not to defend, but to harvest. They pulsed with a subtle force, drawing the key, the life force, the vital energy from the people of Viridia, leaving them as brittle and lifeless as discarded iron. The elders whispered of a slow, agonizing death, a draining of the soul. My senses, honed by years of tracking in this desolate land, picked up a subtle distortion in the magnetic field ahead. The air thrummed with a low, almost imperceptible vibration. I adjusted my grip on the salvaged ship's hull blade, a brutal instrument far more suited to shattering than cutting. The steel was a deep charcoal gray, thick with a patina of rust, and it felt strangely warm in my hand, pulsing with the echoes of countless battles. Rounding a crumbling embankment, I saw them. The Iron Legion, 10 warriors, clad in armor forged from the same salvaged metal as the Shogun's fortress. Each man was a walking siege engine, their magnetic weaponry crudely constructed rifles and pistols radiating a sickly orange glow. They were systematically dismantling the last vestiges of Viridia's defenses, securing the area for the Shogun's arrival. Their movements were robotic, devoid of any genuine aggression, yet their presence radiated a chilling certainty. They weren't fighting, they were collecting. I recognized the crude mechanism of their rifles. They amplified and channeled the magnetic force of the Shogun's main system, directing the stolen key towards the villages. I didn't engage directly. Direct confrontation was a luxury I couldn't afford. Instead, I focused on the wind, on the subtle shifts in the magnetic currents. I began to exhale. It wasn't a normal breath. It was a controlled expulsion, a meticulous channeling of the magnetic energy I had absorbed. It started as a subtle shimmer around my scars, a darkening of the metal plates beneath my skin. And then, with a guttural roar that seemed to tear through the very air, the black-orange glow intensified. The effect was immediate. One of the Iron Legion warriors staggered, his magnetic rifle sputtering and collapsing in a shower of sparks. Another clutched at his armor, screaming in confusion as the magnetic field around his arm violently repulsed itself. I was unleashing the Rust Breather, a technique I had painstakingly developed over years of brutal experimentation. It was a dangerous dance, a razor's edge between control and annihilation, but it was the only weapon I had. The rain, already a relentless curtain of iron gray, intensified, blurring the line between the warriors and the dissolving armor, between death and decay. I continued to exhale, a torrent of magnetic dissonance, and the Iron Legion scattered, their weapons useless against the weaponized decay of my own body. The battlefield, once a tableau of enforced order, had become a swirling maelstrom of collapsing metal and chaotic energy. My work had only just begun. Iron-Scourge, Chapter 2. The echo of dissolution. The rain, a viscous, iron-tinged downpour, continued its relentless assault, washing the crimson earth raw. The silence after the initial chaos was not peaceful, but a dense, expectant quiet, punctuated only by the hiss of remaining sparks from shattered armor, and the unsettling, high-pitched whine emanating from Kaito's own body. He stood amidst the wreckage of the Iron Legion's vanguard, a monument to consumption, his form flickering with the same unsettling black-orange glow. The air tasted of burnt metal and ozone, thick and cloying, clinging to his scarred skin like a second layer. He wasn't hunting the remaining warriors with the savage grace of a predator. He was a force of erosion, a slow, deliberate dissolution. The remnants of the Iron Legion, panicked and disoriented, moved erratically, attempting to shield themselves with their remaining armor. But the magnetic dissonance he unleashed found them regardless. One, a young man barely more than a boy, his face slick with sweat and a growing dread, managed to raise a fractured shield of polished steel. Kaito exhaled, a controlled burst of the Rust Breather. This time, the effect wasn't immediate disintegration. Instead, the shield pulsed with a blinding white light before fracturing into 1,000 razor-sharp shards, embedding themselves in the boy's armor, and ultimately into his flesh. The boy screamed, a choked, guttural sound swallowed by the rain, and collapsed, a bloody smear against the rust-colored ground. Kaito didn't linger. There was no satisfaction in the death, only the cold, methodical process of consumption. He felt a faint tremor within his chest, a burgeoning warmth as more iron, more magnetic energy flowed into him. The village elders, huddled behind a makeshift barricade of salvaged wagon wheels, watched with a mixture of awe and terror. Their faces, etched with years of oppression and brittle with fear, reflected the unsettling brilliance of his transformation. The Rust Eater, stammered old man Hiroshi, his voice hoarse. Hesh is a demon made of metal itself. The Shogun's fortress, a grotesque monument to control, loomed over them. Its colossal magnetic emitters still sporadically emitting waves of disruptive force. It was a wounded beast, vulnerable despite its intimidating size. Kaito knew he couldn't simply attack it head-on. The Shogun would undoubtedly unleash countermeasures, gravity-warped projectiles, magnetic storms, perhaps even something more insidious. He needed a path, a disruption within the fortress core. He began to walk, not with purpose, but with an almost agonizing slowness, his movements deliberate, each step measured, as if testing the very ground beneath his feet. He wasn't seeking a direct route to the throne room. Instead, he headed for the auxiliary generator, a hulking monstrosity of gears, coils, and polished brass that powered the magnetic emitters. He reasoned that disrupting its function would create a cascade effect, destabilizing the entire fortress. As he approached, the air thickened with a palpable magnetic pressure. The Iron Legion, sensing a new threat, began to regroup, their remaining armor gleaming ominously in the rain. They raised their magnetic rifles, aiming with desperate accuracy, but Kaito anticipated their attack. He stopped, raising his arms, and initiated the Ferrous Overload. This was a far more volatile technique than the Rust Breather. It demanded complete control, a terrifying synchronization of his internal magnetic field with the external currents. His body surged with a blinding light, the black-orange glow intensifying to a pulsating, almost unbearable white. The ground around him seemed to ripple and distort, as if reality itself was bending to his will. The Iron Legion warriors staggered back, clutching their heads in agony. Their armor, already weakened by the Rust Breather, began to violently repel itself, tearing at their flesh, shattering bone. But the generator remained stubbornly intact, its mechanisms whirred with unsettling precision, unaffected by the onslaught. Kaito realized, with a chilling certainty, that the Shogun had anticipated this, layering defenses around the generator, designed to channel and redirect any magnetic disruption. With a guttural roar, he shifted his focus. He wasn't trying to destroy the generator, he was attempting to understand it, to map its magnetic pathways, to find the node of greatest vulnerability. He extended his hand, his metal-infused fingers brushing against the generator's casing. The contact was not one of aggression, but of absorption. He felt the flow of energy, a chaotic torrent of magnetic currents, and began to subtly manipulate it, not with force, but with a delicate, almost surgical precision. He visualized the flow, imagined the pathways, and with a final, focused exhale, he redirected a single, critical pulse. The generator sputtered, choked, and then, with a deafening screech of metal on metal, ceased to function. The fortress shuddered. The rain, no longer iron-gray, turned a sickly yellow, reflecting the flickering light of the collapsing magnetic emitters. The Shogun's throne room, bathed in an eerie, silent luminescence, beckoned. Kaito turned, his form now almost entirely consumed by metal, his eyes bottomless pits reflecting the distorted landscape. "The echo of dissolution begins," he rasped, his voice a grating chorus of grinding metal. "And tonight, we harvest its silence." Chapter 3. The architect of ruin. The silence following the generator's death was a viscous, unsettling thing. It wasn't simply the absence of mechanical screech, but a dampening of all sensation, as if the crimson delta itself held its breath. The rain, now a sickly, jaundiced hue, clung to the shattered remains of the magnetic emitters, twisted spires of blackened steel that resembled the skeletal fingers of a grasping beast. The air tasted not of iron, but of ozone and something older. Something akin to the dust of forgotten stars. Kaito stood within the ruined throne room, a silhouette sculpted from polished rust and flickering light. His form was almost entirely integrated with the decaying machinery. Fragments of the generator's casing formed articulated plates on his arms, and thin conduits of metal pulsed with a faint internal luminescence beneath his scarred skin. He moved with a chilling grace, a ballet of fused metal and decaying technology, a living embodiment of the very ruin head wrought. The Shogun's remnants, a fractured husk of the man, and the mountain of scrap metal head, ruled upon, pulsed with a residual magnetic charge, a ghostly echo of the energy head attempted to control. It wasn't hostile, but deeply curious, as if the last vestiges of the Shogun's consciousness were trying to comprehend the fundamental paradox of Kaito's existence. "You sought to understand my design," Kaito's voice, a chorus of grinding metal and static, echoed through the ruined chamber. "You believed you could dissect the flow, map the currents. But all creation, all design, is predicated on instability, on the inevitable feedback loop of entropy." He extended a hand, a gleaming, segmented digit tracing a pattern in the dust coating a shattered gear. "The true architecture of destruction lies not in brute force, but in the elegant precision of disruption." As he spoke, the floor beneath him shifted. Not dramatically, but subtly, like the settling of tectonic plates. Small, articulated segments of the Shogun's throne plates of polished steel, etched with bizarre geometric symbols, began to detach and rotate, forming a miniature, self-assembling labyrinth beneath his feet. They weren't weapons, not directly, but instruments of disorientation, designed to disrupt the delicate balance of spatial awareness, a reflection of the Shogun's warped understanding of order. Suddenly, a low, rhythmic pulsing emanated from the depths of the labyrinth. It wasn't magnetic in the conventional sense, but a resonant frequency, a vibration that directly targeted the metal within Kaito's own body. The effect was disorienting, amplifying the metallic hum within him, pressing against the boundaries of his consciousness, attempting to unravel his carefully constructed sense of self. He didn't flinch. He met the intrusion with counter-resonance, focusing his own metallic energy into a precise counter-frequency, a deliberate disruption of the Shogun's pattern. The labyrinth continued to shift and reform, but Kaito remained anchored, a solid point in the chaotic flux. "You underestimated the value of pain," he said, his voice gaining a chilling clarity. "The Shogun's defenses weren't about preventing destruction, they were about ensuring your consumption. Each layer of shielding, each redirection of energy was designed to feed my hunger, to accelerate the process of transformation." He believed in the beauty of becoming. From the shadows beyond the shifting labyrinth, figures began to emerge. Not the Iron Legion, but constructs of salvaged metal and dark energy automata, crafted in the Shogun's image. Their movements were jerky, unsettling, like broken clockwork, but their eyes, glowing with a malevolent violet light, tracked Kaito with chilling accuracy. They were not warriors, but extensions of the Shogun's will, designed to trap and assimilate, to add another layer to his own decaying edifice. "The last architect of ruin," Kaito murmured, his hand now coated with a viscous, rust-colored fluid, always leaves behind his apprentices. He didn't attack. Instead, he moved with terrifying speed, weaving through the automata, using the labyrinth itself as a weapon. He shattered the shifting plates with focused bursts of magnetic energy, creating localized disruptions that slowed the constructs, causing them to stumble and collide with each other. His movements were less a fight, and more a surgical dismantling, stripping away the Shogun's carefully constructed defenses with ruthless efficiency. As the last automaton collapsed into a pile of sparking metal, a single perfect sphere materialized from the center of the throne room. It was constructed entirely of a shimmering, obsidian-like material, pulsating with a contained, almost unbearable energy. "The seed," Kaito said, his voice a rasping whisper. "The final iteration of the Shogun's obsession. A conduit for raw magnetic potential, designed to expand his dominion across the delta. A self-replicating catastrophe." He extended his hand, his metal fingers closing around the sphere. As he did, a blinding light erupted, filling the throne room with an overwhelming surge of energy. The sphere began to expand, not outwards, but inwards, consuming Kaito's form, integrating his own metallic essence into its core. His eyes, once bottomless pits reflecting the distorted landscape, now burned with the same violet light as the automata. He stood transformed, no longer simply a ronin of rust and metal, but a vessel of pure, chaotic energy, a living, breathing nexus of magnetic disruption. "The storm has ripened," he said, his voice now a terrifying symphony of shattered metal and crackling energy. And tonight, we unleash its full fury. Chapter 4. The Iron Bloom. The rain had ceased, leaving behind a slick, unsettling sheen on the shattered remains of the Shogun's fortress. It wasn't a deluge, but a persistent, oily drizzle that clung to the rusted landscape, carrying with it the scent of ozone and decay. The air itself vibrated with a low, constant hum, the residue of Kaito's transformation, a dissonant chord of magnetic resonance. He stood amidst the wreckage, no longer a solitary figure, but a storm contained within a shifting silhouette of metal and violet light. The villagers, initially frozen with terror, now approached cautiously, their faces etched with a mixture of awe and profound fear. They carried offerings, crude tools forged from salvaged metal, woven mats dampened with collected rainwater, small clay figurines depicting the sun gestures of respect and desperation in a world suddenly defined by the impossible. Kaito didn't acknowledge them. He was lost in the escalating symphony of his own being, the violet light of his eyes pulsing in time with the rhythmic throb emanating from his chest. He felt the relentless pull of the sphere, the seed not as a threat, but as a burgeoning extension of himself, a grotesque mirror reflecting the accumulated suffering of the Crimson Delta. He moved then, not with the deliberate, calculating grace of a warrior, but with a spiraling, almost agonizing fluidity. The violet light intensified, bathing the surrounding landscape in an ethereal glow. The ground beneath his feet seemed to distort, the rusted earth twisting and buckling as if resisting the sheer force of his transformation. He was becoming less a man, more a localized weather system. "You seek to understand," he rasped, the words torn from his newly synthesized voice, a grinding of metal against bone. "You seek to comprehend the horror I have become. But comprehension is a luxury the universe can rarely afford." He turned, and his gaze swept across the assembled villagers, each face a miniature representation of the despair he had witnessed. He raised a hand, and the violet light coalesced into a shimmering blade, not of steel, but of pure magnetic force. It wasn't a weapon intended for cutting, but for unraveling. He moved towards the largest of the clay figurines, a representation of the sun, and with a single deliberate motion directed the magnetic blade at it. The figurine didn't shatter. Instead, it began to vibrate violently, the clay resonating with a desperate, frantic energy. Cracks spiderwebbed across its surface, and the magnetic field began to leach away its solidity, reducing it to a cloud of dust that swirled around Kaito like a miniature tornado. "The smallest offering, the smallest hope," he said, his voice dripping with a chilling detachment. "Reduced to nothing, like all things touched by the Shogun's madness." As he spoke, a new tremor ran through him. The seed was accelerating his transformation, not just adding to his magnetic capabilities, but fundamentally altering his very structure. His metallic skin began to shift and flow, reshaping itself into intricate patterns. The whorls of a seashell, the veins of a leaf, the geometry of a snowflake, a chaotic tapestry of cold, hard steel and alien, shimmering energy. Suddenly, a sound cut through the humming chaos, the distinct clang of metal on metal. A small group of the Shogun's remaining automata, remnants of the Legion, had arrived, drawn by the escalating distortions. They were smaller than the behemoths that had fallen, more agile and equipped with razor-sharp magnetic blades designed to pierce armor. They moved with a cold, programmed precision, a terrifyingly efficient tide of metal and gears. Kaito didn't engage in combat. He didn't need to. He simply felt them. His augmented senses a confluence of pain, magnetic resonance, and burgeoning psychic awareness pinpointed their locations with terrifying accuracy. He raised his hand, and the violet light coalesced into a field that pulsed with a nauseating intensity. The automata, caught within the field, began to convulse, their internal mechanisms grinding against each other in a symphony of destruction. Their movements became erratic, their blades spinning uselessly as the magnetic field disrupted their controls, turning them against themselves. One by one, they collapsed, dissolving into showers of sparks and shattered metal. But as they fell, Kaito realized something profound. The seed wasn't merely fueling his transformation. It was subtly influencing the environment itself. The rust-colored earth around him began to bloom not with flowers, but with intricate, crystalline structures composed entirely of magnetically aligned iron filings. They sprouted and grew with impossible speed, forming grotesque, geometric formations that resembled colossal, petrified blossoms. "The Delta remembers," he murmured, his voice infused with a strange, mournful beauty. "It remembers its own wounds. And now, it blooms with them." He paused, his violet eyes focused on the rapidly expanding iron bloom, a terrifying, beautiful monument to his corruption. He was no longer simply a weapon, he was the weapon. And the weapon was the land itself. "The storm has ripened," he repeated, a slow, deliberate cadence to the words. "And tonight, the bloom shall fall." Chapter 5. The Iron Bloom. The rain had ceased, leaving a film of slick, iridescent metal dust coating everything. The air thrummed with an unnerving resonance, a constant, low hum that vibrated not just in the bones, but in the very marrow of existence. The village, once a collection of huddled, despairing forms, was now a surrealist tableau, villagers rebuilding their homes with salvaged metal, their faces etched with a strange mixture of awe and terror, meticulously collecting the crystalline blossoms that erupted from the earth. They treated Kaito's trail as a sacred path, leaving offerings of meticulously polished coins and fragments of broken weaponry. Kaito moved through them, a ghost amongst the resurrected. He was no longer simply walking, he flowed, his body a channel for the escalating energy within him. The translucent nature of his arm intensified, the humming intensifying into a high-pitched whine that scraped against the edges of perception. The violet light within his eyes burned with a more frantic urgency, as if desperately trying to decipher the accelerating changes within his own being. He felt himself becoming less man, less even a weapon, and more a nexus, a point where the corrupted essence of the Delta manifested. He encountered a young boy, no older than 10, meticulously arranging shards of rusted armor around a nascent blossom. The boy, Kenji, held out a single perfectly formed iron crystal, its edges sharp and glittering. "For you, Rust Eater," he whispered, his voice a thread of vulnerability against the burgeoning chaos. "To help you bloom." Kaito reached out, his hand facing through the boy's offering before momentarily solidifying, grasping the crystal. As the cold metal touched his skin, a jolt of raw, chaotic energy surged through him, intensifying the violet light, accelerating the growth of the blossoms. He felt a brief, terrifying kinship with the boy, a shared understanding of the horrifying beauty of this transformation. "The bloom is a reflection," Kaito rasped, the words strained, imbued with the mournful cadence had cultivated. "A crystallization of the pain. It feeds on despair, but it also seeks completion." He noticed that the blossoms weren't simply growing, they were arranging themselves. The geometric structures, initially haphazard, were now forming increasingly complex patterns, spiraling fractals, impossible tessellations of iron, and disturbingly, representations of human faces, frozen in expressions of eternal suffering. Suddenly, the ground beneath him began to shift. The crystalline blossoms pulsed with a brighter light, and the ground around him buckled, forming a spiraling chasm filled with a swirling vortex of iron filings. From its depths, tendrils of solidified magnetic energy emerged, reaching out with a hungry, deliberate precision. "The Delta remembers," Kaito repeated, his voice laced with a chilling resignation. "It remembers its own wounds, and now it blooms with them." He understood with a brutal clarity. The seed wasn't merely altering him, it was reshaping the entire Delta. The magnetic distortions weren't just drawing out the villagers' life force, they were drawing out the memory of the land itself, its suffering, its violence. its unending cycle of decay. He drew his rusted ship hull blade, now almost completely consumed by rust, its edges shimmering with an unsettling blue light. He didn't attack. Instead, he moved, not with a warrior's aggression, but with a disturbing grace, weaving through the tendrils of magnetic energy, disrupting their flow with precise, almost surgical movements. The tendrils recoiled, momentarily disrupted, but then, with renewed intensity, they surged forward. This time, however, Kaito anticipated their advance. He extended his hand, and the violet light from his eyes intensified, coalescing into a focused beam that slammed into the heart of the vortex. The chasm shuddered, and the swirling energy within began to dissipate, replaced by a torrent of crystalline blossoms that exploded outwards, coating him in a shimmering, metallic rain. As the last of the magnetic tendrils retreated, Kaito collapsed to his knees, his body racked with spasms. The violet light within his eyes threatened to consume him entirely. He felt his bones shifting, his flesh hardening, becoming increasingly intertwined with the crystalline structures that surrounded him. He was becoming part of the bloom. Then, he noticed a single perfect bloom, larger than the others, hovering a foot above the ground. It pulsed with a brilliant, almost unbearable light, and within its crystalline core, he saw a fleeting image, a memory, not his own, but belonging to the Delta itself. He saw the land before the Shogun, a place of natural beauty, vibrant with life. He saw the arrival of the first invaders, drawn by the promise of the Delta's key and the subsequent devastation they wrought. And he saw himself, a younger version of himself, standing amidst the carnage, consumed by a similar desperate urge to save the villagers, an urge that ultimately led him down this path, transforming him into this living monument to ruin. "The storm has ripened," he whispered, his voice no longer his own, but a chorus of voices. The wind, the water, the rust, and the silent screams of the forgotten. "And tonight, the bloom shall fall." He raised his hand, and the violet light within his eyes flared, illuminating the monstrous, beautiful bloom one last time. The final spark was not a weapon, but a surrender. As the light exploded outwards, it didn't destroy. It released. It shattered the crystalline structures, dissolving them into a fine, shimmering dust that swirled upwards, carrying with it the last vestiges of Kaito, the Rust Eater, leaving behind only a vast, desolate plain, forever stained with the memory of iron and the impossible beauty of a bloom that never would. Chapter 6. Echoes in the Ash. The silence after the bloom was heavier than the iron dust that clung to everything. It wasn't a peaceful silence, but one born of obliteration, of a truth revealed with devastating clarity. The rain, having shifted to a brittle, oily sheen, mirrored the state of Kaito's remains, fragmented, iridescent, and utterly devoid of warmth. The villagers, initially stunned into a near catatonic state, began to stir. Old man Kenji, the village elder, a man whose face was a roadmap of the Delta's harsh history, was the first to move. He wasn't approaching the center of the devastation, where the remnants of the bloom had scattered like crushed jewels, but rather to a low stone wall that had miraculously held through the Shogun's collapse. He knelt, meticulously gathering the shimmering dust with a worn wooden scoop, a rhythmic, almost meditative act. "It's not about stopping the rust," he murmured, his voice surprisingly steady. "It's about understanding its hunger." Around him, others followed suit, driven by a compulsion neither born of fear nor reverence, but something far more unsettling, a recognition. They weren't seeking to erase the memory of Kaito, but to participate in its slow, inevitable dissolution. They understood with a chilling certainty that he hadn't been a savior, but a reflection. I descended into the ravaged valley, drawn by the activity. The air tasted of ozone and regret, the metallic tang intensified by the rain. The scale of the destruction was immense, a brutal tableau of shattered magnetism and dissolving steel. I moved through the dust, almost facing through the remains of the Shogun's fortress, experiencing a fragmented sensation of immense pressure, a phantom struggle against forces beyond my understanding. It was a dizzying, unsettling journey through the Shogun's final, desperate defenses. As I approached the wall where Kenji worked, I noticed he wasn't just collecting the dust. He was arranging it, meticulously building a miniature replica of the Shogun's fortress, a chaotic, distorted echo constructed entirely from the remnants of Kaito's transformation. The fortifications were haphazard, the angles unsettlingly wrong, but the inherent power of the materials, the fragmented magnetic fields, the traces of the Shogun's gravity warp, pulsed with a disconcerting resonance. "You're trying to contain it?" I said, my voice raspy from disuse. Kenji didn't start. He simply continued to arrange the dust, his movements precise, almost surgical. "We are learning to speak the language of the rust," he finally replied, his gaze distant. The Shogun didn't simply use the ki, he became it. He consumed, he adapted, he mirrored the delta's inherent corrosion. He pointed to a particularly dense cluster of dust near the base of the miniature fortress. "Look closely." As I peered into the swirling particles, I realized what he was showing me. Embedded within the dust were not just fragments of metal, but miniature, perfectly formed blossoms identical to the bloom that had destroyed Kaito. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of them, each pulsating with a faint violet light. They weren't merely remnants of the bloom, they were its echoes, each one vibrating with a memory of its existence, a phantom iteration of the original. "The bloom wasn't a gift," I stated, the realization hitting me with the force of a physical blow. "It wasn't an offering of beauty. It was a trap." Kenji nodded slowly. "The Shogun sought to perfect the cycle, to create a perpetual bloom, sustained by the kai of the villagers, a living monument to his dominion. But the delta doesn't yield to control. It resists. And it expresses that resistance through these echoes, 1,000 attempts to bloom, each one ultimately shattered, each one reinforcing the storm. Suddenly, a low hum filled the air, growing in intensity. The miniature fortress began to vibrate, the dust within it swirling faster and faster. The violet light emanating from the miniature blossoms intensified, bathing the valley in an unsettling glow. I looked up, and I saw it, a new bloom, emerging from the heart of Kenji's meticulously crafted fortress. It wasn't a single perfect flower, but a chaotic, writhing mass of petals, each one pulsing with the violet light, each one whispering with a chorus of voices, the rust, the wind, the water, and faintly, the echo of Kaito's last, desperate plea. This bloom wasn't beautiful. It was terrifying. It was the distilled essence of the delta's corruption, a living, breathing manifestation of its ceaseless hunger. Kenji knelt before it, offering a handful of the shimmering dust. "Take it," he urged, his voice a mere whisper. "Become part of the cycle." As I reached for the dust, I understood. Kaito hadn't been destroyed. He had been absorbed, not into the Shogun, but into the land itself. He was now woven into the fabric of the delta, a constant, subtle influence, a phantom rust eroding the foundations of everything. The final spark, I realized, wasn't a surrender. It was a transformation. We weren't fighting the rust. We were becoming it. Chapter 7. Echoes in the rust. The rain had ceased entirely, leaving the crimson delta slick with an unsettling sheen not of water, but of pulverized metal. The air hung thick and heavy, saturated with the scent of ozone and a sickly sweetness I couldn't quite place. Kenji remained kneeling before the bloom, a fragile silhouette against its pulsating violet heart. The hum intensified, a subsonic drone that seemed to resonate not in my ears, but within my bones. The fortress, once a testament to obsessive order, was now a fractured shell, its walls weeping rust-colored dust that flowed like blood. I approached cautiously, my hand instinctively hovering near the hilt of my own blade, a repurposed bellows, blackened and pitted, that felt surprisingly comfortable in my grip. It wasn't a weapon of beauty, but a tool of necessity, forged from the wreckage of a world consumed by hunger. Kenji hadn't moved, his eyes fixed on the bloom, a slow, serene smile twisting his lips. He was, in a way, already gone, subsumed by the growing, whispering chaos. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he murmured, his voice almost lost in the bloom's drone. To witness the confluence of all things to be consumed and reborn. I wanted to scream, to lash out at his unsettling acceptance, but found myself paralyzed. There was a terrible logic to his surrender, a seductive allure in the bloom's quiet insistence. The villagers, huddled together in the relative shelter of what remained of their homes, watched us with a haunting mixture of fear and reverence. They were the forgotten, the broken, and Kenji, in his madness, had offered them a perverse salvation. The bloom pulsed again and I saw it, a shimmering fragment of Kaito's face within its depths. Not a clear image, but a fleeting impression, eyes like black pools, a slight, almost imperceptible curve to his lips, a flicker of the weary acceptance I'd seen in his final moments. It was as if he was not merely in the delta, but a layer within it, a memory embedded in the rust. "He didn't die," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "He simply fragmented." Kenji turned his head, his eyes now carrying a disconcerting glimmer of understanding. "He wasn't defeated, young one. The Shogun sought to contain him, to control the very force that made him a weapon. But true strength lies not in containment, but in expansion. The rust doesn't consume, it transcends." He raised his hand, offering me a pinch of the shimmering dust. It felt strangely warm, radiating a faint vibration that mimicked the bloom's pulsing rhythm. "Take it," he urged, his voice gaining a little strength. "Don't resist. Let it flow through you." I hesitated, battling a primal urge to crush the offering to powder. The memory of Kaito's final words echoed in my mind, "Your fortress is your prison, but I am the rust that eats the chain." This was not defiance, it was an inescapable truth. Taking a deep breath, I reached out and closed my hand around the dust. It clung to my skin, a cold, slick sensation that spread rapidly through my veins. The world around me seemed to distort, colors intensify, sounds becoming sharper, more insistent. The hum of the bloom amplified, vibrating through my entire being, and I felt a disconcerting sensation of dissolution, not of my flesh, but of myself. Images flooded my mind, disjointed and chaotic, the Shogun's fortress, the metal demon, the endless cycles of consumption and decay. But layered beneath these fragments were others, flashes of Kaito's past, moments of his battles, the brief, desperate kindness had shown the villagers. He wasn't a single man anymore, he was a torrent of experience, of pain, of survival, channeled through the very fabric of the delta. As the dust flowed through me, a painful awareness settled upon me, the realization that I wasn't merely absorbing the bloom's essence, I was becoming part of it. I could feel the iron in the ground, the moisture in the air, the subtle shifts in the magnetic currents that governed the Shogun's reign. I wasn't resisting the transformation, I was embracing it. Suddenly, the bloom flared with a blinding violet light. And a voice, not spoken but felt, resonated within my mind. It was Kaito's, layered with the accumulated echoes of the delta, ancient and weary, yet undeniably present. "The cycle continues," the voice whispered. "And you, young one, are now a part of its heart." I looked down at my hand, now radiating a faint, purple glow. The scarred metal of my skin seemed to melt and coalesce, flowing seamlessly into the dust clinging to my palm. I was no longer just a ronin, a warrior, adrift in a ruined world. I was something more. Something fundamentally rust. Chapter 8. The echo of the forge. The violet glow had subsided, leaving behind a residue of stillness in the air, thicker and colder than the metallic rain. My hand, now perpetually shimmering with that spectral purple, felt ancient. Not in the way an old warrior feels the weight of battles, but a deeper, geological age. It was as if I were an imprint of the delta itself, a solidified whisper of its endless decay. I wasn't resting. There was no respite. The bloom, or whatever it was, had woven itself inextricably into my being. It wasn't a possession. Not exactly. It was an understanding. A knowledge that throbbed with the rhythm of the iron-rich earth. I could anticipate the movements of the magnetic currents with unnerving accuracy, predict the patterns of the rust storms, and even, unsettlingly, sense the fading echoes of those who had been drained of their ki, their last thoughts, their final fears, swirling within me like phantom eddies. The villagers, cautiously emerging from their homes, watched me with a mixture of awe and terror. They had witnessed a miracle, a destruction of unnatural order. But the transformation of Kaito was something beyond comprehension. Old Man Hiroshi, the village elder, a man weathered like a granite statue, approached me with a reverence bordering on supplication. You are the bloom," he stammered, his voice a dry rasp. "The spirit of the Delta, reborn." I didn't respond with words. Instead, I raised my hand, the purple glow intensifying, and directed a pulse of energy towards a patch of barren earth. Almost instantly, a tiny sprout emerged, a vibrant, metallic green fern, its leaves shimmering with the same violet luminescence. It wasn't a plant of life, but of resistance, a testament to my altered state. "The Shogun sought to steal our life force," I finally articulated, the words feeling clumsy and foreign on my tongue, filtered through the burgeoning consciousness of the Delta. "He built his fortress on a lie. That decay is an end, not a beginning." My movements, once characterized by brutal efficiency, were now imbued with a glacial deliberation. I moved with the flow of the magnetic currents, almost gliding across the rust-colored earth. It was as if I were a conduit, channeling the power of the Delta through my form. The villagers began to experiment, cautiously approaching objects infused with the violet glow. A shattered piece of the Shogun's throne, carefully held, began to mend itself, the rust receding, the metal regaining a semblance of its original form. A dying child, brought to me in a state of profound weakness, showed a flicker of animation, his breath deepening, the brittle pallor of his skin softening. But the bloom demanded a price. The process of integration was agonizing, a constant influx of sensory data, a merging of identities. I felt the accumulated sorrow of the drained villagers, their fear, their desperate yearning for a life that had been stolen. It threatened to drown me, to overwhelm my remaining sense of self. Suddenly, a rhythmic clang echoed through the valley. It was coming from the ruins of the Shogun's forge, a massive skeletal structure of blackened steel and shattered gears, still radiating a faint magnetic hum. Figures emerged from the shadows, clad in the remnants of the Iron Legion armor, led by a grizzled veteran named Kenji. Kenji, unlike the other legionnaires, hadn't been crushed in the explosion. He had retreated, driven by a fanatical belief that Kaito was a blasphemy, a perversion of the Shogun's will. "You've become a tool of the Delta," he roared, raising a crude hammer forged from the Shogun's broken gear. "This is not salvation. This is corruption." He charged, swinging the hammer with brutal force. I didn't meet his attack with a sword. Instead, I simply listened to it. I felt the kinetic energy of his blow, the magnetic pull of the hammer, and instinctively redirected the force, sending the hammer spinning back towards him, embedding itself deep in his armor. The legionnaires followed suit, attacking with a relentless fury, their magnetic weapons aimed at my increasingly unstable form. But I was no longer simply a warrior. I was a nexus, a resonating chamber for the Delta's power. The magnetic pulses were absorbed, amplified, and then released back with devastating precision, not as attacks, but as disruptions unraveling the Legionnaires' armor, shattering their weapons, disorienting them with a torrent of fragmented memories. As Kenji fell, his last sight was the violet glow emanating from my hand, slowly consuming his face. He died not with a scream of defiance, but with a silent, echoing whisper. Rust, the final spark of the bloom, flared. And I understood. I was not just becoming part of the Delta. I was the Delta. The cycle of consumption and decay wasn't an ending, but a transformation, a slow, inevitable reformation, driven by the core essence of the land. My arm, once a mosaic of scars and metal, was now entirely translucent, a shimmering purple conduit of magnetic energy. The sky above the crimson delta began to darken, not with clouds, but with a reflection of my own being, spreading across the rust-colored landscape like an encroaching tide. Chapter 9. Echoes in the Rust. The rain had ceased, leaving behind a silence thicker than the iron dust that clung to everything. The air tasted of ozone and something ancient, something that resonated with the decaying pulse of the Delta. I stood amidst the wreckage of the Shogun's throne room, the shattered remains of the gravity warp a testament to my intrusion. A glittering, unstable ruin. My arm, now almost entirely transparent, pulsed with a violet light, casting elongated, distorted shadows that danced with the wind, a wind that carried the whispers of consumed memories. The villagers, a ragged collection of survivors, huddled in the lee of what remained of the palace walls, their faces etched with a mixture of awe and terror. They hadn't spoken since my arrival, simply observing, absorbing the reality of what had transpired. Their eyes, once dull with the ki drain, now held a strange, unnerving clarity. They had witnessed not just a battle, but a dissolution. I moved amongst them, not with the deliberate grace of a warrior, but with a hesitant, almost mournful drift. My movement seemed to displace the rust, to stir the remaining iron filings into a low, grinding murmur. The effect was unsettling, like a ghost in a graveyard, a remnant of a destroyed order. Old man Hiroki, the village elder, approached me, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch my arm. As his fingers brushed against the pulsing violet, a flicker crossed his face, a brief image of the Shogun's face, contorted in a rage, superimposed on the vibrant color. He recoiled, a choked gasp escaping his lips. "The echoes, they are strong," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "You are not simply absorbing the iron, Kaito. You are absorbing time itself." He was right. The effect wasn't merely physical. The violet energy was drawing upon the residual energy of every event that had occurred within the fortress: the Shogun's rise to power, the construction of the magnetic defenses, the lives of the villagers consumed. It was an exhausting process, a draining of not just metal, but of the very fabric of existence. I realized with a chilling clarity that I wasn't just a warrior dissolving a fortress, I was becoming a repository for its history. A living echo chamber of destruction. Just then, a tremor ran through the ground. A wave of magnetic energy, weaker but still potent, emanated from the mountains beyond the valley. It was a reflexive response from the remaining fragments of the Shogun's defenses, attempting to reassert control, to pull me back into its orbit. Instinctively, I raised my hand, the violet light intensifying. I channeled the energy, not into an attack, but into a resonance. I focused on the source of the tremor, visualizing the intricate network of magnetic conduits that had once sustained the fortress. The energy flowed through me, a torrent of fragmented memories, the calculations of the engineers, the panicked commands of the guards, the agonizing moments of the villagers' ki drain. With a silent, agonizing pulse, I amplified the energy, sending it back towards the mountain. It didn't manifest as an explosion, but as a cascade of sonic vibrations, a shattering of the magnetic lattice itself. The tremors ceased, replaced by a high-pitched whine that seemed to tear at the very air. But the effort was taking its toll. My body shuddered, the violet light fluctuating wildly. I felt a searing pain in my chest, a sensation of something being ripped apart, of my own being unraveling. I realized, with dreadful certainty, that I was not merely absorbing the past, I was becoming it. "Stop!" a voice cried out. A young woman named Hana, one of the few remaining healers. She moved towards me, carrying a small pouch filled with powdered herbs, remnants of a forgotten art. "You're consuming yourself." I waved her away, a silent command. "It's necessary," I rasped, my voice a fractured echo of its former self, "to contain the damage." As Hana approached, I saw it, a shimmering, translucent hand reaching out towards her, an extension of my own corrupted being. She didn't scream. Instead, she looked at me with an expression of profound sadness, a recognition of the inevitable. "You are beautiful, Kaito," she whispered, a single tear tracing a path through the iron dust on her cheek. "But beauty born of destruction is a fragile thing." As she spoke, her body began to shimmer, her flesh dissolving into a violet haze. Her consciousness, her memories, became another layer within the accumulating chaos of the Delta. I watched, horrified and strangely serene, as she vanished, leaving only a faint scent of wildflowers and a single, perfectly preserved lotus flower resting on the shattered remains of the throne. The violet light in my arm flared one last time, blindingly bright. Then slowly, it began to fade. The pulsing ceased. The shimmering transparency diminished, leaving behind only a faint residual warmth. I stood there, alone amidst the ruins, no longer a warrior, no longer even entirely human. I was something more. I was the echo, the rust, the dissolving core of the Crimson Delta. And within that dissolution, I carried the memory of a single valiant ronin who had dared to eat the storm. Chapter 10. The Weight of Echoes. The rain had ceased, leaving the Crimson Delta draped in a perpetual twilight, a bruised purple sky, reflecting the iron-stained ground. Days bled into one another, marked only by the slow, agonizing shift of the rust within me. I existed now as a locus of decay, a silent observer of the valley's tentative recovery, a slow, hesitant green pushing through the wreckage, nourished by water that still tasted of metal and regret. Hana's disappearance had settled into a cold, heavy stone in my core, a constant, subtle ache against the dissolving edges of my being. I moved with a disconcerting fluidity, my movements guided by the residual magnetism, a ghost echo of the Shogun's control. The villagers, initially wary, now left offering small bundles of polished riverstones, carefully arranged wildflowers, and the occasional drop of purified rainwater at the perimeter of what remained of the throne room. They seemed to understand, instinctively, that I was not a threat, but a consequence. A terrible, beautiful consequence. My existence was a paradox. I was the solution, the one who had extinguished the Shogun's tyranny, yet I was also the embodiment of its destructive potential. The rust within me pulsed with a terrifying efficiency, capable of dismantling anything touched by magnetic influence, but increasingly difficult to control. I found myself instinctively pushing away, warding off the nascent life that began to sprout in my wake, a single hardy poppy, a cluster of moss, clinging to a shattered pillar. Life was a transgression, a challenge to the inevitable, and I couldn't bear to grant it. I sought out the old woman, the last of the herbalists, a brittle figure named Ito, who had once tended to the village with her powdered herbs. She had been the one to identify the danger of the Shogun's magnets, the way they leached the land of its vitality. She found me near the wreckage of the palace archers, kneeling beside a pool of shimmering rust, meticulously cataloging the composition of the metal fragments, a futile exercise, I realized, but one that offered a strange, grounding purpose. "You may become a storm, Kaito," Ito said, her voice a dry rattle. "A beautiful, terrible storm. The land remembers your sacrifice, but it also fears your touch." She examined my hand, now almost entirely translucent, tracing the patterns of the dissolving metal with a gnarled finger. The energy. It's not just magnetic anymore. It's resonant. You're absorbing not just iron, but echoes. The Shogun's rage, Hana's sorrow, the villagers' desperate hope. They're all becoming part of you. Her words resonated with a chilling truth. I was absorbing everything, accumulating the wreckage of the past, layering it onto my already fractured existence. I felt the phantom weight of the Shogun's ambition, the lingering grief of Hana's sacrifice, the fragile hope of a people slowly rebuilding their lives. There's a way to mitigate it, she continued, her eyes clouded with ancient knowledge. A technique my grandfather taught me. A silence rite. It's a dangerous practice, requiring absolute stillness, a complete severance from all external stimuli. It will push you closer to the void, but it may also allow you to stabilize. The concept was terrifying. To willingly surrender to the inevitable, to willingly embrace the dissolution, it was a surrender to oblivion. Yet, the alternative was a slow, agonizing unraveling, a complete loss of self. It requires a focal point, Ito said, handing me a small, intricately carved wooden box. A conduit for the energy. Something of profound stillness. Something without memory. Inside the box lay a single, perfectly formed river stone, cool and gray, worn smooth by centuries of water. It was unremarkable, ordinary. Yet Ito insisted it possessed a unique property. It resonated with the pure, untainted energy of the earth. As I held the stone, I felt a surge of resistance within me. A frantic attempt by the accumulated echoes to cling to me, to resist the stillness. The rust within me flared, pulsing with a frantic orange intensity. But I held firm, focusing on the stone, channeling my own dissolving essence into it. The air around me shimmered, distorting the already surreal landscape. The rust within me began to slow, the pulsing diminishing to a gentle throb. I felt myself becoming quieter. The voices of the past receded, muffled by a growing blanket of silence. The weight of my existence, the burden of the Crimson Delta, felt momentarily lifted. Then, I saw it. A reflection in the polished surface of the river's stone, not my own distorted image, but a nascent one. A young man, clad in worn leather armor, a solitary figure standing on a windswept ridge, a broken katana at his side. He carried the same haunted eyes, the same air of weary resolve. It wasn't me. It was a possibility, a potential iteration of myself, a ghost of what I might have been if I hadn't eaten the storm. And as the reflection faded, I realized with a chilling certainty the rust wasn't just consuming me. It was creating me. I was becoming a record, a chronicle of iron and loss, echoing through the heart of the Crimson Delta, destined to dissolve and reform endlessly in the face of the inevitable. Chapter 11. The Echo of Stone. The rain had ceased, leaving behind a slick film on the rusted earth and the skeletal remains of the fortress. It wasn't a cleansing rain, but one that seemed to amplify the silence. A silence so profound it pressed against the eardrums, punctuated only by the high-pitched thrum emanating from my dissolving arm. The villagers, a small trembling collection of humanity coated in a perpetual film of iron dust, watched me from a distance, their faces etched with a mixture of awe and terror. They didn't approach. They didn't understand. Only the wind carried whispers of my name, Kaito, the Rust Eater, a name that felt both ancient and utterly alien. I moved deeper into the valley, following the trail of shimmering, fractured earth, the air growing colder with each step. The metallic tang in my breath thickened. Not just the familiar scent of old iron, but something newer, sharper, the faint, acrid odor of ionized stone. The stone. Ito's stone. It had become a focal point, a silent obsession. I hadn't consciously sought it out, but the stone seemed to pull me, a subtle magnetic force guiding my movements. Ahead, nestled within a shallow grotto carved by the relentless winds, lay a circle of standing stones, each a jagged shard of basalt blackened with age. They weren't arranged in any discernible pattern, just a random collection of silent witnesses to the valley's slow, agonizing demise. And in the center, resting on a bed of moss riddled with rust, was the stone. It wasn't the polished river stone I'd held before. This one was rough-hewn, almost violently so, its surface a chaotic tapestry of fissures and sharp edges. The color was different, too, not the pale gray of the river stone, but a deep, bruised purple, as if the stone itself held a captive storm. As I approached, the thrumming within my arm intensified, vibrating with an almost unbearable frequency. The reflections began again, flickering across the stone's surface, but they were no longer a single fixed image. They were shards, fragments of myself, branching out like shattered mirrors. I saw a boy, barely a teenager, wielding a crude spear, battling scavengers in the shadow of a collapsing watchtower. I saw an old man, ravaged by the metal demons, offering a final, futile prayer. I saw countless iterations, each a consequence of my choices, each a fading echo of what I could have been. Then I saw him. He was younger than the others, perhaps 30 years of age, though time seemed fluid within this place, a concept warped by the stone's strange influence. He wore a worn leather haori, identical to the one I had been wearing when I first entered the Crimson Delta, and clutched a broken katana, the same one I'd discarded long ago. His face was younger too, less scarred, more vibrant, yet his eyes held the same haunted, weary resolve. It was as if a part of me, a dormant possibility, had been unearthed and given fleeting form. He didn't move. He simply watched me, a silent acknowledgement of our shared destiny. "You are the echo," I rasped, my voice a dry whisper lost in the wind. "The point where the rust breaks and reforms." The reflection of him wavered, as if acknowledging my words. Then, a single drop of iridescent liquid, resembling molten metal, dripped from the stone's surface and landed on my hand. The contact was immediate and searing, a flood of sensation, not pain exactly, but a profound understanding, a recognition of the endless cyclical nature of my existence. I understood then that the stone wasn't just recording my fate, it was accelerating it. It wasn't creating me, but dismantling me, pulling apart the threads of my being to reconstruct them in a slightly different form. Each interaction with the stone added another layer to this endless cycle, another iteration of Kaito, a testament to the corrosive power of loss and the futile struggle against the inevitable. As I stared at the reflection of the young warrior, I noticed something new, a subtle shift in his expression, a glimmer of something akin to sorrow. He wasn't just witnessing my dissolution, he was experiencing it. Suddenly, he moved. He raised his broken katana, and with a fluid, practiced motion, sliced through the air. It wasn't a physical attack. It was a gesture of acceptance, a silent farewell. And, as he did, the reflection shattered. The young warrior dissolved into shimmering dust, returning to the stone, becoming one with the echo. I was left alone, the thrumming within my arm now a deafening roar. My arm was almost entirely gone, dissolving into a haze of metallic particles. I could feel myself becoming increasingly ethereal. Less a man, more a conduit for the rust, a vessel for the echoes of the Crimson Delta. I looked at the stone. It pulsed with a renewed intensity, its purple surface swirling with nascent reflections. Another iteration was already forming, a phantom of a man with a haunted gaze and a broken katana. "It's not an end," I said, my voice barely audible. "It's just a rearrangement." The stone pulsed in response, and I knew, with a chilling certainty, that I would continue to dissolve, to reform, to echo, for as long as the rust flowed through my veins, a prisoner of the Crimson Delta, forever bound to its desolate, metallic heart. Chapter 12. The echo of the forge. The rain had ceased, a melancholic gray clinging to the fractured remnants of the Shogun's fortress. The air, once thick with the metallic tang of disruption, carried only the faint scent of damp earth and a lingering, unsettling hum, the reverberation of Kaito's final transformation. I, or what remained of me within the stone, felt the shift keenly, a tightening coil within the nascent form taking shape around me. This iteration, the one that had witnessed Kaito's dissolution, was different. The stone wasn't simply reflecting, it was remembering. The memory of his final gesture, the heartbreaking acceptance etched into his spectral face, clung to the newly formed contours. It wasn't a fleeting image, but a viscous stain, a subtle distortion in the purple hue, like a drop of rust bleeding into polished jade. I attempted to speak, to ask the nascent Kaito about the nature of this echoing existence, but the words felt strangely detached, filtered through a layer of cold stone. What have I become? I managed, my voice a low resonance within the stone's core. The stone pulsed, a slow, deliberate rhythm that seemed to articulate a single, unsettling response, a conduit. I understood, with a grim clarity that bypassed logic, that I was not merely absorbing the echoes of the Crimson Delta, but actively feeding them. Each iteration, each fragmented recollection of Kaito's struggle, added to the stone's awareness, fueling its own unsettling metamorphosis. I was in essence becoming a living archive of devastation, a repository for the Shogun's cruelty and Kaito's sacrifice. Suddenly, a tremor ran through the stone. A violent shudder that forced me to solidify, to take a physical form. The newly formed Kaito's hand clenched into a fist, his spectral gaze fixed on the swirling purple surface. He raised his broken katana, the salvaged ship's hull now integrated seamlessly into its frame, and began to carve, not into the stone but into the air. It wasn't a battle cry, but a lament, a slow, deliberate dance of destruction. The katana moved with a haunting grace, slicing through the air with a silent, agonizing precision. Each movement created miniature distortions in the surrounding space, fleeting reflections of collapsing buildings, distorted faces of the villagers, the horrifying image of the Shogun's gravity field ripping through the air. As he moved, I observed a subtle change within myself. The metallic tang in my core intensified. Not the familiar taste of rusted iron, but something older, something akin to the initial despair of the village before the Shogun's tyranny, the raw, desperate fear of a people robbed of their key. It was a deeply unsettling sensation, a visceral injection of trauma that threatened to overwhelm my already fragile awareness. "Stop," I commanded, my voice a rasping whisper. "You are feeding the stone. You are amplifying the echoes." He paused, the katana hovering midair. His spectral eyes, the bottomless black pits, seemed to scrutinize me with a disconcerting intensity. "It is not feeding the stone, waste man," he said, his voice a fractured echo of the past. "It is the stone. The stone is the echo." He resumed his movements, the katana's dance growing more frantic, more desperate. I realized with growing horror that he wasn't simply creating images, he was actively shaping the stone, guiding its transformation, manipulating its memory. "You are trapped," I shouted, struggling against the encroaching despair. "Bound to this cycle of destruction." He didn't respond. His movements became more erratic, a whirlwind of rusted steel and spectral anguish. Then, with a final agonizing flourish, he completed the movement. The air shimmered, and a miniature replica of the Shogun's fortress complete with the gravity warp field materialized before me, collapsing inwards with a silent burst of energy. As the last vestiges of the miniature fortress dissolved, Kaito's form began to unravel, not in a dramatic explosion of metal and light, but in a slow, agonizing decay. The purple stone around him pulsed with a frantic intensity, absorbing his essence, feeding the echoing nightmare. I felt myself being drawn into the vortex of his dissolution. The metallic tang in my core, growing to an unbearable pitch. The memories, the echoes, the pain, intensified, threatening to consume me entirely. And then, just as I was about to be swallowed whole, a flicker of awareness remained. I managed to focus, to will myself to separate, to resist. I reached out instinctively, grasping for something, anything to anchor myself. My hand landed on the hilt of his broken katana. As my fingers brushed against the cold steel, a faint warmth spread through me. A residual trace of Kaito's essence. I felt him, not as a ghost, not as an echo, but as a fleeting, profound understanding. "Don't," he whispered, his voice a silent plea. "Don't become another echo." And with that final heartbreaking utterance, he was gone. The stone pulsed one last time, a slow, mournful rhythm. I was alone, once again, a solitary, fragmented consciousness within the heart of the Crimson Delta, bound to the eternal cycle of rust, destruction, and the unsettling, silent remembrance of a warrior who had dared to become something more than just iron and bone. The stone pulsed, shifting its hue, slightly a subtle deepening of the purple, a faint trace of orange, the color of the Rust-Eater's breath. Another iteration was forming, and I knew with a chilling certainty that the cycle would continue. Chapter 13. Echoes in the Static. The rain had ceased, leaving the Crimson Delta a landscape of bruised purple and ochre, slick with a film of iron oxide. The air hung thick and heavy, a palpable weight of static electricity. I stood amongst the scattered remnants of the Shogun's fortress. Twisted fragments of magnetic armor, shattered projections of scrap metal, and the unsettling stillness where his throne had once reigned. It wasn't a victorious silence, though. It was the silence of complete eradication, a void carved out of order. My body felt different. The constant, gnawing hunger was receding, replaced by a low-level hum, a resonant vibration that seemed to emanate not from within me, but from the earth itself. The metallic tang in my mouth, once a desperate necessity, now lingered like a phantom spice, a reminder of the process of consumption, of dissolving the very fabric of the world around me. The translucent quality of my arm intensified, the skin shimmering with a faint internal luminescence. I was becoming, undeniably, more than iron. I knelt beside the broken katana, its hilt cool and smooth beneath my hand. The whisper of Kaito, "Don't become another echo," still echoed in the hollow chambers of my mind. It was a lament, a warning, and a terrible, beautiful paradox. He had sought to transcend his own fate, to break the cycle, and in doing so, had become a part of it, a fractured shard of his will, trapped within the relentless progression of rust and decay. A figure emerged from the swirling mist that clung to the valley floor, a young woman, no older than 17, clad in patched cotton robes the color of dried moss. Her eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of awe and a profound, unsettling grief. She approached cautiously, carrying a small earthenware bowl filled with what looked like pulverized shale. "Ronin-sama," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We have been gathering this. It's said to possess a cleansing quality." I didn't respond, merely observing her. Her movements were hesitant, graceful, imbued with a respect born of desperation. The villagers were learning, slowly, to understand the nature of my existence, to see me not as a monster, but as a force of chaotic, ultimately destructive beauty. "The tremors have lessened," she continued, offering the bowl. "The earth remembers the Shogun's touch. We hope this will soothe it." I took the bowl, the shale crumbling between my fingers. It offered no solace, no immediate relief. It was a futile gesture, a desperate attempt to impose order on a world defined by entropy. I didn't need it. I needed something else. "Tell me," I rasped, my voice strained, a low, grinding echo of Kaito's. What do you understand of the magnetic pull? The girl hesitated, glancing nervously at the surrounding wreckage. The Shogun, he claimed it was a fundamental force, that he could draw strength, vitality from the world itself, manipulating it through magnetic resonance. And you believe this shale, it disrupts this resonance? She nodded. The elders say that certain minerals, particularly those rich in iron and quartz, create a counter-resonance. They disrupt the flow, weaken the hold. I understood. It was a rudimentary attempt to fight fire with less fire. A tragically elegant strategy, born of a people stripped bare, desperately seeking a way to reclaim their stolen life force. As I spoke, I noticed a subtle shift in the air, a prickling sensation on my skin. The internal hum intensified, coalescing into a sharper, more insistent vibration. It felt like a probe, an assessment, a silent question. The stone that had formed from the Shogun's remains was pulsing again, slower this time, but with a deliberate rhythm. Suddenly, a flicker, a momentary intensification of the purple in my arm, and I saw it. Not with my eyes, but with a deeper, visceral sense. The stone wasn't merely pulsing, it was remembering. It was attempting to reconstruct the Shogun's presence, to reassemble the shattered fragments of his consciousness. The process was agonizingly slow, each pulse a step closer to a full resurrection. I realized with chilling clarity that Kaito hadn't truly vanished. His essence, the echoes of his will, had been subsumed by this nascent reconstruction, threatening to overwrite everything. "Stop!" I commanded, my voice gaining a strange, metallic resonance. I channeled the energy flowing through me, the residual magnetism of my existence, and directed it towards the stone. It wasn't a forceful attack, but a deliberate disruption, a focused wave of counter-resonance designed to shatter the nascent construct. The stone shrieked, a silent, agonizing vibration that resonated through the entire valley. The purple deepened, swirling violently before finally dissipating, leaving behind a dull, gray surface. The young girl cried out, shielding her eyes. I knew, with a sickening certainty, that this was only a temporary reprieve. The cycle wouldn't be broken easily. The Rust Eater was not a destroyer, but a catalyst, a force of relentless entropy, destined to forever haunt the Crimson Delta, feeding the echoes of a fallen warrior and forever seeking to unravel the fragile threads of existence. Chapter 14. The Ghost in the Rust. The rain had ceased, leaving the Crimson Delta slick with a film of oxidized water, a mirror reflecting a bruised and unsettling sky. The air, once thick with the acrid tang of magnetic decay, was now strangely clean, carrying a faint, almost metallic perfume, a phantom scent of shattered steel and absorbed ki. But the quiet was not peaceful. It was a held breath, a pregnant pause before the inevitable unraveling. I moved through the remnants of the Shogun's throne room, a landscape of pulverized weapons and swirling iron dust. The floor was a treacherous patchwork of compacted rust, occasionally yielding beneath my weight with a soft, unsettling sigh. The purple pulse had vanished, leaving behind only a ghostly sheen on the stone, a stubborn reminder of the terrifying truth that Kaito wasn't gone. Not entirely. The villagers, huddled together in the relative safety of what remained of the palace walls, watched me with a mixture of awe and profound dread. Old Man Ito, his face etched with a lifetime of hardship, offered a silent bow, his wrinkled hand outstretched as if to ward off some unseen evil. I offered a small, curt nod in return, the movement stiff and deliberate, a performance honed over years of solitude. The task before me was not one of triumph, but of desperate containment. My arm throbbed, a discordant vibration mirroring the faint, rhythmic hum that seemed to emanate from the stone. It felt less like a physical sensation and more like a psychic intrusion, the relentless, insistent whisper of a consciousness struggling to coalesce. The reconstructed Shogun wasn't building a body, he was building a memory, a phantom existence fueled by the echoes of his own destruction. The resonance is strengthening, I rasped, my voice stripped of inflection, the metallic resonance a constant companion. Each sunrise brings it closer to completion. Young Hannah, the girl who had witnessed the initial pulse, approached me cautiously, clutching a small, tarnished iron token, a fragment salvaged from the Shogun's helmet, a morbid talisman. "Sensei," she whispered, her eyes wide with apprehension. Do you think he remembers everything?" I didn't answer immediately. There was no easy answer, no comforting lie. "He remembers what he wants to remember," I finally said, each word a carefully measured weight. "The desire to dominate, to consume. It is a potent catalyst." I began to systematically dismantle the remaining fragments of the throne, not with violence, but with calculated precision. Using a technique I'd refined over countless battles, magnetic weaving, I manipulated the residual magnetic fields, creating localized disruptions that weakened the nascent construct, pushing it back, however briefly, into the silent void. It was a frustratingly slow process, like trying to hold back a flood with a handful of sand. As I worked, I noticed a subtle shift in the air. The iron dust itself seemed to respond to my movements, swirling and coalescing, forming fleeting, distorted shapes, faces, weapons, armor fragments of the Shogun's past, projected onto the dust motes. I realized with a growing horror that the reconstruction wasn't just building a body, it was actively interpreting the remnants of the Shogun's existence, solidifying his will into a tangible form. "His learning," I said, my voice low and strained. "His learning how to manipulate the echoes, to shape them to his desire. His not merely recreating himself, his becoming adaptable." Suddenly, a tremor ran through the room. The stone, previously a dull gray, pulsed with an unsettling violet light. The air thickened with a static charge, and I felt a jarring pressure against my mind. A wave of overwhelming aggression, a raw, untamed hunger. I braced myself, channeling the ferrous overload, my body transforming into a shimmering cage of magnetic energy. The violet light intensified, focusing on the stone, and I felt the familiar, agonizing surge of power as the construct fought back, attempting to merge with my own essence. "You cannot contain him," a voice echoed in my mind, not spoken, but felt, a torrent of icy contempt and ruthless ambition. "You are merely feeding his rebirth." I fought back, directing the energy flow not to attack, but to disrupt, to introduce chaos into the carefully constructed order. It was a battle not of strength, but of will, a desperate struggle to maintain my own identity against the relentless tide of the Shogun's reconstruction. The room filled with a blinding white light, followed by a deafening roar. When I could see again, the stone was intact, the purple pulsing with a furious intensity. But something was different. The distorted faces in the dust had vanished, replaced by a single, terrifyingly clear image, the Shogun's face, frozen in a mask of triumphant malice. And in his eyes, I saw not just the reflection of a fallen warrior, but the nascent spark of a new, terrifying dominion. "The Rust Eater," he said, his voice a cold, metallic whisper, "is not a destroyer. He is an ingredient." Chapter 15. The Echo of Consumption. The rain had ceased, leaving the Crimson Delta not cleansed, but layered with an unbearable, iridescent sheen. It clung to the shattered fragments of the Shogun's fortress, reflecting the sickly glow that emanated from Kaito's decaying form. He stood amidst the wreckage, a silhouette carved from rusted steel and fading humanity, his left arm now almost entirely gone, a cascade of shimmering particles that drifted on the wind like captured stardust. The humming within him intensified, a high-pitched whine that grated on the very bone. The star had consumed. It wasn't merely brightening, it was remembering. He hadn't collapsed. He hadn't even stopped moving. Instead, he circled the perimeter of the devastation, a silent, agonizing rhythm of absorption. Small, metallic fragments, remnants of the Shogun's armor, the broken mechanisms of the gravity warp, Even the dust of the dead villagers were drawn to him with an irresistible force, becoming integrated into his already bizarre composition. It wasn't sustenance anymore. It was a desperate, futile attempt to repair a collapsing architecture, to hold on to the ghost of his former self. A flicker of movement caught his attention. From the depths of the ruined throne room, a figure emerged, slow and deliberate, shrouded in a dark, oiled silk kimono. It was Hana, one of the few villagers who had survived the initial assault, her face streaked with grime and grief, but her eyes holding a terrifying, unnerving calm. She wasn't bearing a weapon. She carried only a small, intricately carved wooden box. "Kaito-san," she said, her voice a low, mournful echo. "We have found this." It was amongst the Shogun's possessions. She presented the box to him. It was crafted from a single piece of dark oak, inlaid with silver depicting stylized magnetic currents. As Kaito approached, the box pulsed faintly with the same violet light had experienced in the throne room. Though weaker, a lingering stain on the air. He examined it, his hand a tangle of metal and scar tissue hovering over the lid. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. The information, the intent within the box, slammed into him with the force of a collapsing mountain. It wasn't a weapon. It was a recording. A meticulously crafted chronicle of the Shogun's rise. A tapestry woven from stolen memories, manipulated data, and calculated cruelty. It showed him, not as a desperate survivor, but as a carefully constructed pawn, a tool exploited by the Shogun's followers for their own ambitions. The Shogun hadn't simply been obsessed with magnetic energy, he had been building a psychic resonance, feeding off the desperation and fear of the villagers to amplify his own power. He anticipated this, Kaito rasped, the words fragmented, choked with the metallic tang of his own being. He used your fear to fuel him. Hana lowered her head. We believe he sought a way to transcend the limits of the magnets, to become something more. As she spoke, Kaito noticed something else. The violet light wasn't just emanating from the box. It was coming from him. The star wasn't merely consuming him. It was amplifying the corrupted energy he had absorbed, channeling it through him into a terrifying, self-sustaining feedback loop. Ah! Suddenly, the ground beneath him began to tremble, not with seismic force, but with an internal resonance, a shifting of magnetic fields, a reordering of reality itself. The rust particles swirling around him intensified, coalescing into a vortex of shimmering energy. He felt his consciousness fragment, his memories blurring, replaced by echoes of the Shogun's ambition, his cold, calculating logic. "You are becoming the storm," Hana cried out, her voice filled with horror. "The energy you consume, it corrupts you." He tried to resist, to wrest control, but the Shogun's influence was overwhelming. His own body, already a grotesque fusion of metal and flesh, began to shift and contort, the magnetic fields within him surging with an unnatural intensity. His eyes, once hollow pits of darkness, now burned with a brilliant violet light. "It's not corruption," he said, his voice no longer his own. A chillingly smooth baritone laced with the metallic rasp of the delta. "It's optimization." He raised his remaining arm, a gleaming spire of rust and steel. The air around him shimmered with static charge. He didn't raise it to attack. He raised it to listen. From the heart of the ruined fortress, from the very core of the shattered magnets, he heard them, the whispers of 1,000 souls trapped within the Shogun's control. Their fear, their despair, their agonizing pleas for release. "Join us, Rust Eater," the voice commanded, a chorus of icy satisfaction. "Become the conductor. Become the storm." Done. And as Kaito, or what remained of him, stood amidst the devastation, he realized the horrifying truth: he hadn't saved the village, had merely become the instrument of its final, inevitable consumption.